Thanks, Dr. Thwaites, for answering some of our
Yeah,
follow-up questions.
no worries.
One of the questions, or a few of the questions, had to do with your method. Sort of,
Mm.
one was how did you come up with this method? I mean, how did you land on transitive and intransitive verbs for
Okay.
your specific project?
All right. So I don't know if this is going to be helpful for your students too much, because actually what happened was that research subject came from an earlier study. So basically, I had done two studies before that. One, I was trying to figure out why different people give different responses to verbs. That was based on something that my PhD supervisor had done in the past. Then I realized that partly the reason we get different responses to different words is that they have different grammatical class. So I did a study on just using 50% nouns and 50% verbs, and looked at the differences in responses to those. And from that study, there was basically one verb in that data set which was an intransitive verb, and it just had a completely different profile of responses. Just the pattern that I described last time. And so when I looked into that, I realized that nobody had really researched that before, but there was a suggestion in my study that it would be interesting. So that's kind of how that came up.
That kind of leads me to a question based on something we were talking about today. When,
Okay.
as you're doing your research and you start to see these other questions,
Yeah.
how do you stay focused on what you set out to do, or do you sometimes readjust what your question is for that particular project?
It's pretty important to be clear about your goals for that project from the start and to follow it through. So for me, like, I just keep a notebook, basically like an online notebook of ideas that come up during the research, and just note them all down. But get to the end of the original project before you start pursuing anything else, because otherwise, like, you just end up with your wires crossed and too many things going on. And sometimes your research, your original research question doesn't end up yielding very much. You know, you find that actually the things that you thought you would find, you didn't find. And at that point, you can maybe start to look at the research and the data in a different way and see if there's another way of cutting it up. But I think you've got to be true to your original intentions, first and foremost.
Thank you. Yeah. Another big question was talking about who you chose to be a part of it, how many you decided to use. Can you talk a little bit about your sample and subject?
Yeah. So the question about sample size was interesting. There are statistical ways of calculating sample size. So you put in the size of the sample population, and you can do this online. Like, you can just type in sample size calculator, and you type in your population size, and it'll give you the ideal sample size. Mm-hmm. For me, though, so the population size is basically everybody who speaks English as a first language. So we're talking like 500 million people. So the sample size required for that is something like 400. And I couldn't get 400 people. So basically, this cuts into a really big problem in a lot of research in linguistics or psychology, which is that most professors just end up asking their students to do the research, you know, to fill in the questionnaires or whatever. So actually, the sample that you end up using isn't that representative of the whole population, because it's just narrowly like a bunch of people aged 18 to 22. And they're all studying the same subject. These were linguistic students. So probably wasn't a very representative sample. And then the sample size of 50, that was basically what I could get. A lot of the time, that's what we end up doing, just as many as possible. 50 I judged to be enough, because similar studies had been published with 20 participants, 30 participants. So essentially I went on that. It was not very scientific, I'm afraid. It's quite, pragmatic, but that's how I ended up with that.
Yeah. Another thing we're learning is that your research is going to add to the conversation. It's not necessarily going to solve everything perfectly. Is that
right?
Do people nail you for that, like at conferences, or do they ask
No.
like, who? No.
No, there are frequent jokes at conferences about the sample size, because everybody knows that this is an underlying problem for our discipline. But nobody, well, people are getting better at fixing it now because we're starting to use the internet to recruit people. So the methods have improved in the last 5 or 6 years as people have started to experiment with crowdsourcing. But yeah, it's just an ongoing issue. I've submitted papers for publication recently, and nobody has ever come back to me saying the sample size is too small.
Yeah. That also in our paper, we're supposed to, going back to the method, talking about talking about the question, like in your paper, do you also surmise or talk about what this research may lead to in terms of like other questions? Do you ever include those questions in the paper that you're writing?
Yeah.
And like limitations, do you address that your sample size is not as big as it should be? Like, is that something that's noted in your paper?
Okay, so questions, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely note down questions for further research. It's kind of part of our job, I think, to tell people how to use what we've done, because sometimes it's not immediately obvious what should come next or what the benefit of this research is. So you give people a little push in that direction, and it can be helpful. It can increase the number of citations that you get, and that's the kind of uptake of your research. Limitations, yeah, I would certainly mention limitations of the study, but to be honest, sample size is not one that I've mentioned before, just because honestly my sample size was bigger than comparable studies. I mean, it was double the size of some comparable studies. So
nice. Okay.
Yeah.
It's not only important for your research to be worth your time, but for you to be able to connect it back to a broader context to establish relevance. That being said, is it okay to not have an explanation of your research results and its significance? Is it acceptable to simply have new data?
Yeah, I thought that was an interesting question as well. My answer is no, it's not acceptable to do that. I'm sorry to say. You can kind of take this to extremes and imagine some kind of hypothetical research where you just investigate like who likes fart jokes the most? Is it 5-year-olds or is it 50-year-olds? So I don't know, maybe somebody somewhere in academia is trying to answer that question, but it's hard to imagine it. And I think we all know the answer. So at the very least, I would say, like, if you have an idea for research and you're not sure if it connects to broader questions that a community of people are asking, see if you can find a community. And if it doesn't exist somewhere in formal academia, ditch the question.
Yeah.
Move on to something else. Yeah.
One more question that reminds me. We've been doing a lot of exploring and basically gathering sources that will hopefully be used in the literature review and enable the students to find the gap in research. Are you at a point in your career where you pretty much what's out there currently, or do you still have to do a lot of digging and finding the community and the questions and making sure your question is relevant to what's going on?
Yeah, so other people may give different answers to this, but for me, like, I feel that that's just an ongoing thing. I don't know when you get to a point as an academic where you just know the questions that need to be answered, but I'm not there yet. Like, I'm 2 years out of my PhD and I'm doing independent research, but I still wrestle with like these competing ideas in my head. Like I have ideas for data collection, and I know that the data will be interesting to me, but you know, you can't start collecting this data until you are really sure about the questions you need to answer. So that's the other side, like making sure that the questions are worthwhile and, you know, connect to the community. So yeah, there's still a lot of backtracking and rereading stuff that I read before, and maybe communicating with people, you know, in various different areas, and just trying to make sure that the questions that I'm asking are relevant and valid. Yeah, I think that's not something you learn quickly. It takes time.
Awesome. Thank you. I feel like you touched on every part of the paper, and I think we've answered the big questions here. So thank you so much again.
Yeah, no worries. No worries. Glad to be helpful.